The Socialism Conference is the place in this country where we meet people who are involved in movement work, activist work on the ground in communities all across the country.
What I really love about Socialism Conference is that it's a space to be in community with other socialists, be in community with other people who are thinking about how do we actually build a movement for revolutionary and radical change in the world, and also just to have fun and hear about some of the work that each other is doing, to be inspired.
There is nothing that recreates the experience of being in Rome and being able to fellowship, being able to share ideas for energetic vibrations that can't be captured via Zoom or via teleconference.
It's an opportunity for us to meet like-minded people. While we have a million differences, we're all in the struggle to make a better world, to make a world of balance and peace and justice and joy. And I find comrades here every time I come.
It's a place where we can dream about abolition and think about how we're going to create campaigns, how we're going to deconstruct the state while we're simultaneously creating the communities and care we need for all to survive and thrive.
If you are in any form of radical politics, movement building, art practice, facilitation, healing, and restorative work, I don't know of another gathering that happens like this that puts those entities together. And it's not just an elitist conference. A lot of times you can go to a space like this and there's a lot of top line names and everyone else feels like an audience. But here this feels like a community.
A person that believes in racial justice and the social good. Socialism might be a place where you could find your folks.
If you believe that we deserve a world where people are cared for, where people's needs are met, and where people can truly self-determine, Socialism is a conference for you. This space will help connect you to those people for you to grow and build with for years to come.
Intensely radical politics.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
This event is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Now more than ever, it is critical to support independent publishers, independent bookstores, and independent voices.org. And secondly, by joining the Haymarket Book Club. The following event will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel. These upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. You can register for these upcoming events on the Haymarket Books Eventbrite page. If you miss an event, you can listen to the recording afterward by subscribing to our podcast. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we cannot guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate these guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. We should have time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. Thanks for joining us today. Our event will begin shortly.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to all of you in YouTube land to let us know where you're beaming in from. And also, if you'd like, share your creative practice or a creative calling that you have. It doesn't have to be formal, just would love to get to know. I am here to introduce myself and the series. So my name is Nati Linares. I go by she, her, or mommy. I'm a mother, a communications and cultural organizer at Art.coop, and I'm beaming to you live right now from New York City, aka Shaolin, Staten Island, Lenape land. We feel so honored to co create this virtual learning experiment with the good folks at Haymarket Books, the University of Illinois Chicago, or UIC, and their Social Justice Initiatives Portal Project, Artists for Radical Imagination, or RE, for helping make this happen and connecting the hearts today. So, welcome. Today we're kicking off a three-part series connecting artists, designers, and content creators who aspire to contribute to movements for collective liberation with grassroots organizers and educators working in the areas of economics, climate, and abolition. Each event in the series will correspond with soon-to-be-released booklets published through the portal Growing the World We Want Conference, hence the name Through the Portal Learning Series, conference at throughtheportal2024.com. So our goal with the series is typically, as a lot of you know who are here today, artists and culture workers, get brought in as decoration or entertainment at these sorts of conferences and gatherings, rather than brought in as key contributors and organizers themselves in their communities. And we at Art to create spaces for dialogue, learning, and exchange. We believe that artists engaged in organizing are absolutely necessary if our movements for justice are to advance. And we hope that this series will lead to more and long empires around us crumbling. The series is designed as an introductory space. So there will be a lot of unanswered questions, and we might not get to all your longings and desires, but we urge you to put your questions in the chat and connect with us. Portal Growing the World We Want conference, where artists may submit work. We hope this series will support artists in any creation of work related to the gathering. Our two presenters today are economics professor and popular educator Francisco Perez and mixed media artist and solidarity economy organizer Camila Tapia Williams. Francisco will lead us through a 101 style presentation on the basics of what is capitalism, what is a solidarity economy, and how do we get free as artists and culture workers. And then Camila will share with us their project, Transverse Cooperative. So you get an example of a local project on the ground. And a chat on YouTube for your questions so we can get to as many as we can. So thank you so much for being here, everyone. And I'm going to start with Francisco. And thank you again to Haymarket Books and everyone involved today. So Francisco, kick us off, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here. Excited to be collaborating with Haymarket. We will not be able to push to advance these ideas without the input of artists and creative workers. And then artists also need a solidarity economy. Many of you who are artists know that the economy for artists can be often very precarious. So first, so we'll go through who I am. We'll talk a little bit about what capitalism is, so that we can talk about what capitalism is not, right? How we can move away from capitalism towards something more just, equitable, and sustainable. And then we'll talk about what those alternatives are that often go under this name, a solidarity economy or economic democracy. We'll talk a little bit about the different names that people use. And then I'll give you some examples of how artists are participating in the solidarity economy, creating worker co-ops, housing cooperatives, and trying to get community finance and participatory budgeting dedicated to artists. So first, who am I? So next slide, please. My name is Francisco Perez. I use he, him pronouns. I grew up in New York City, the son of working class Dominican immigrants. I actually grew up in a limited equity housing cooperative in Morningside Heights, Manhattan. So that was my introduction to these ideas, to these economic principles. So I didn't read about this stuff first and became convinced that it worked. I realized that this stuff worked because my family was able to stay in a highly gentrified part of Manhattan because we were collective owners. I'm also a former grant writer at the Museum for African Art, which is how I got involved, started thinking about how art gets funded, how artists get paid. I'm the former director of the Center for Popular Economics while I was doing my PhD in economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So we are a collective of students, faculty, and alumni at UMass Amherst who try to get economics out there to the people. So part of what you're seeing, part of what you'll see here today is materials developed by my comrades at the Center for Popular Economics going back almost 50 years. I'm now a senior economist at the Center for Economic Democracy in Boston. And as my day job, I teach economics at the University of Utah. We now live in Salt Lake City. I am also the father of two little artists, as you see here, Zemi and Lido. And I mention this because as a father of two small children, it's clear that everyone is born an artist. And then finally, if you want to learn more about what you heard here today, or if you have questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter or Instagram. I'm at Blacktonomics. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing today is part of our curriculum, social justice activists, usually a week-long in-person retreat. Are happy to say we were able to pilot a version of this which has the objective of building greater cohesion between liberatory artists, organizers, and intellectuals to make possible more just, larger workshop series called EAT. So, think of this as a sample, and if you would like to have more there about EAT. Next slide, please. So we are going to start. I realize this is a big topic, page about what capitalism is, so we can talk about what alternatives to capitalism used. In the interest of time, we're going to focus on the first three. That sounds like a mouthful, but we all know what this means. We all know what all of this stuff means intuitively, even if we're not familiar with these words. It means someone, right? Most of the productive resource in our society, the offices, the buildings, the farmland, the tools, equipment necessary to produce anything are owned by individuals, right? And everywhere you go, you will see no trespassment and set up shop there, as many settlers, as many squatters have, including people like my parents. The person or the corporation that owns that apartment or house can call the cops and say, look, this is my property and you are trespassing. You have to leave, or otherwise the police will threaten you with violence and the potential loss of your freedom. Sounds, again, like quite a mouthful, but just means everything we need to make stuff, right? So if you work at a coffee shop as a barista, the means of production are the coffee beans, everything you would need to set up a coffee shop, except for the workers who then produce and serve the coffee. So of course, who owns Starbucks? Starbucks is owned by its shareholders, right? And if you stick around too long, they can call the cops. Next slide. Rent ourselves out for a day to a capitalist, right? We do not own the means of production. We cannot, for example, produce coffee for ourselves. Otherwise, if we own the means of production, we could have our own coffee shop and either be self-employed or hire others, right? But because we don't do that, all we own is the skin on our back. We need to go to work for someone who does own the means of production, who is a capitalist. That person, of course, makes money by exploiting us. What do we mean by exploitation? You produce more per hour than you get paid, right? We all know this intuitively. If your boss only made as much money per hour or per day or per week as they paid you, there wouldn't be any incentive for them to hire you, right? They're not in the job creation business. They are in the profit maximizing business. Next slide, please. And then the third rule that we'll emphasize is this notion of the commodity, which is something that is produced to be sold, right? So it is the difference between the tomato you grow in your backyard that maybe you cut up and eat in a salad yourself, or maybe you give it to one of your neighbors, but there's no money transaction there, versus a tomato that is on the shelves at Stop and Shop, which is a big supermarket chain, which is not selling tomatoes to feed the hungry, but selling tomatoes in order to make a lot of money. So, for much of this stuff, a world before wage labor looked like, or a world before commodity production. But the world was very different before capitalism. Even now, in a capitalist society, not everything is wage labor and commodity production, and that there's no reason that has to be the case in the future. Next slide. So you can think of these sort of 5 rules. Again, we emphasize the first 3. You can also add competitive markets and profit maximization. With all of these things, there's been much controversy. People argue and have argued about all of these and what is the essential definition of capitalism. But if we're going to be talking about alternatives to capitalism, we thought it was important to name and shame it. So we offer this definition: capitalism is an economic system where people who own the means of production, capitalists, exploit wage workers to produce goods and services that they aim to sell for profit. Okay, so now next slide. What then is the solidarity economy? So we can think of it as, well, what are the alternatives to each of these rules? And again, we'll focus on the first 3 just in the interest of time. So first, what are the alternatives to the private ownership of the means of production? Well, collective ownership. All of us own it, or none of us own it, right? And examples of institutions that allow us to do that are things like community land trusts, which we'll talk more in detail about in a second. Worker co-ops, right? So co-ops, cooperatives, for companies owned and managed by their workers, right? So no one who does not work there, right? Which is what people traditionally associate with anti-capitalism or socialism, right? So, we could own things together. Next slide, please. So we can also think about alternatives to wage work, right? So you don't historically, again, if you look back far enough, wage labor did not exist, or was a very, very small part of the economy. Right? Most people did it themselves, right? They produced their own food. They lived, what we would call now kind of quote unquote subsistence lifestyle, right? But they grew their own food, made their own clothes, and produced much of what they needed, right? So again, these things exist even now. And of course, worker co-ops, where workers are both workers and owners. And then finally, we can think of many alternatives to commodity production. You don't always produce stuff to sell it for profit. Again, that's not the way it was in the past. And even now, we can think of examples of the production and exchange of goods and services that exist outside of markets, outside of money, right? So things like community gardens, right? You volunteer your time, and then keep the food for yourself or share it with your family, friends, and neighbors. Things like time banks, where we exchange hours of work, but again, without necessarily exchanging money, or just directly barter, right? So I'll give you some tomatoes from my backyard if you give me some lettuce from yours. Next slide. So, if we think of these 3 rules of capitalism: the private ownership of the means of production, wage labor, and production for profit, and again, we'll focus on these 3 of them, then we can think of an alternative for each one, right? So the alternative to private ownership, right? This belongs to me, or this belongs to this corporation, is this belongs to all of us, right? Collective ownership. Instead of workers who are bossed around and exploited, the alternative is, hey, we share the profits, any profits that do exist, and we manage ourselves. We own and manage our own companies. And then the alternative to production for profit, which again leads to so many of our society's ills, right? How do we explain that there are houseless people and empty houses? Well, Those houses were produced not to house people, but to make profit, right? So if the folks who are houseless cannot afford those homes, then they go without shelter, right? So how do we reorient our economy from one that produces solely for profit to one that produces mostly to meet people's basic necessities, human needs, right? Often, as I mentioned earlier, without the exchange of money. Next slide. And then just to make this a little bit more concrete, what we mean by economic democracy, that's about why we use these terms. We're going to define it here as a system where we own and control our workplaces, our land and housing, the investments in our communities, and our government. And what that means concretely is for workplaces, worker co-ops, right? Workers own and manage their companies. For land and housing, it's stuff like community land trust or housing cooperatives, where again, the land is owned collectively, right? The residents who live there own the land together or own the buildings together and then manage those properties together. What would it mean for us to own our own money, right? To control the investments in our community? Well, we can do that through various community finance vehicles, things like public banks and credit unions. Again, many of these institutions have existed for a long time. And then our governments, which are supposed to be accountable to us, are often quite indirect, quite unresponsive. We got a lot of city council members or state legislatures or federal, members of Congress and senators making backroom deals for their own personal career interests, and often quite opaque, right? So what would it mean for us to have direct control over our city-state budgets, right? Where we as citizens directly vote on where our public money goes. Next slide. So there are a lot of images of circles in the solidarity economy. So we can think of these are different ways of conceptualizing the solidarity economy. So you can think of it as different moments, right? There's the moment of creation. That's the land and wisdom and knowledge, language, culture, climate. There's sort of production as we economists think about it, which often takes place through things like community gardens, worker co-ops, producer cooperatives, collective farms. There's the actual exchange or transfer of goods, right? So you produce tomatoes or you produce lettuce or you produce coffee, and then you exchange it for either money or for something else if you're right. So here we don't have to rely on market logic where things go to the highest bidder. We can use things like sliding scale prices, time banks, barter, local currencies, mutual aid, or just gifts, right? And many of these things, again, there's no transfer of money involved. Then for consumption or use, we can think of institutions like consumer co-ops, housing co-ops, food co-ops, the cooperative form, if you haven't figured it out yet, quite flexible. Buying clubs, community land trust, cooperative energy, or community supported agriculture. And then we can think about what to do with our profits, which here we use the term surplus allocation just to mean we have extra. So we don't want to think of it as profits in the same kind of capitalist sense. And there, again, we can put our money, our collective savings into things like community development credit unions, cooperative loan funds, or things like SUSUs. Next slide. I also want to emphasize, again, these are not new ideas, and these are ideas often rooted in the experiences of and then communities of color here in the US. So I love this quote from one of my comrades, Dr. Stacy Sutton at the University of Illinois, Chicago, who's heavily involved in the social justice initiative and is on the board of the New Economy Coalition. Quote, "The solidarity economy movement is not a new movement. It has historical roots in Latin America. In the United States, it builds off the legacy of the Black liberation movement." End quote. Next slide, please. So you can think of, in many ways, think of this as an attempt to remix indigenous economies with the 21st century, right? So many of these ideas are ideas that existed for many of us, come from cultures that had more communal-based societies where things operated, along principles of solidarity. So in many ways, we're just going back to the future. Next slide, please. And again, these ideas have existed for a long time under various names. I won't tell you that these are all the same thing, because they're not. That those are fighting words. People, I'm sure would have and do disagree strongly about all this stuff. But all of these, is this bundle of ideas of sort of democratizing the economy has existed under various names. At least parts of that bundle have existed under various names throughout history. So, we call it solidarity economy. Indigenous groups often prefer the term regenerative economy. The New Economy Coalition uses the word new economy. The Center for Economic Democracy prefers economic democracy. Some people call it social economy. People like Bernie Sanders like the term democratic socialism. Other folks are just call it plain socialism. Feminists are often called this feminist economy. The Hugo Chavez called this 21st century socialism. Sometimes it's called people's economy, eco-socialism, council communism, anarcho-communism, or libertarian socialism. Call it whatever you want. What matters is the fine print, which is people have a say in the institutions where we spend most of our lives, right? So if you spend most of your time at work, you should have a say in what happens at work. Your work is currently a dictatorship where your boss can tell you does tell you what to do. And sometimes have a nice boss, a kind of enlightened dictator, or you have a really terrible boss. But the point is, it is still up to them. We say, no, you should, if the decisions at work affect you, and of course they do, it affects your livelihood, then you should have a say. If you live in a house or apartment complex, you should have a say in how your neighborhood or how your apartment complex is run, right? If there's money coming into your community to build new housing and businesses, you should have a say in what kind of new housing and businesses emerge. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of people trying to do this. Definitely an uphill battle. But the New Economy Coalition, about 150 groups in the U.S. Working on this stuff. Definitely check out their website. They have a map, and then there's several other important networks and organizations like the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops that's having a big conference soon. If you want to learn more about all of this stuff. Next slide. You may already be involved. There is a good chance that you have already contributed to the solidarity economy and are living solidarity without even knowing this term. So if you've engaged in things like mutual aid, time banks, meal swaps, meal trains, saving pools, free schools, clothing swaps, childcare support, book clubs, tool libraries, buy nothing groups, skill shares, all of that, then again, these are all elements of the solidarity economy. Next slide. So again, just to start giving you an idea of what people have to, how solidarity economy could change our lives and what this means concretely. So I love this image by one of our comrades, Carolyn Willard. So I don't have a boss. I'm a worker owner in a cooperative business. I don't have a landlord. I am a member of a land trust, co-op, or intentional community. I don't pay for school. I participate in self-organized schools and demand free education. I don't hoard my stuff. I take part in tool shares, barter clubs, and clothing swaps. I don't buy food that kills. I'm a member of a food co-op, community-supported agriculture, or community garden. And I don't let my bank profit off of me. I joined a credit union, so my money stays in the community. And then let's just skip to the last slide. So again, further resources. If you want to learn more, the New Economy Coalition is a great resource. They've collaborated with groups of artists. So if you want to learn more about that, just Google Creative Wildfire. Again, I encourage you to check out our course, Economics for Emancipation. All of our materials For the entire workshop series is available online. So there's videos, there's a facilitator guide if you want to do it either self-guided or as part of study groups. And then there's a bunch of slides up there as well, all beautifully designed by some of our artist comrades. There's art.coop, which has a directory of solidarity economy and arts examples. And then there's Anti-Capitalism for Artists, groups like the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. So, definitely encourage you to check out their work. But again, the point of all this is we do not have to accept life under capitalism. We can move from the private ownership of the means of production to collective ownership. We can move away from wage labor and exploitation towards self-management and profit sharing. We can move away from producing for profit to producing for need. And artists are building a solidarity economy. They are building their own cooperatives, their own land trusts, and other forms of permanently affordable housing. They are participating in public in participatory budgeting projects and in community finance initiatives. So thank you all today for your time. If you have any questions, please post them and we will get to them in about half an hour.
Thank you so much, Francisco Perez from Economics for Emancipation. Definitely is a 101. Might feel like a lot of information right now, but that's why we're urging you all in the chat. What are those questions that you've had about capitalism, or even those doubts that you have? Maybe Francisco has not convinced you. What are those doubts that are coming up for you? What are those hopes? Where have you seen this in practice? Please keep the chat going. Share with us. We want to hear from you. And now we're going to move to our second part of our series portion with Camila from Transverse Cooperative. Transverse Cooperative is a worker-owned co-op based in Baltimore, and they're serving movements with art and cultural strategy and organizing artists through collective action. Super powerful group. There are groups like this all over the country. The work of art.coop is to identify these groups and unite them so that they can be stronger. So I'm so glad that Camila is here with us today. So it's not just about the abstract economics of it all, of what is capitalism, what is socialism, what is solidarity, but this is actual examples on the ground. And so thank you, Camila, for being with us and sharing a little bit about your project.
Thank you so much, Nati. And thank you, Francisco. Thank you so much, everyone who put this together, Haymarket Books, Art.coop, all of the wonderful organizations. We were so happy to be a part of this. So my name is Camila Tapia Williams. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm here in Baltimore, Maryland, which occupies the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations. And if folks want to put in the chat, I'm just curious if you could change one thing about how you relate to other artists, what would that be? Because I want to get us dreaming as I'm, talking about how I'm doing that in my life and with my cooperative. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so as Nati said, more or less, Transverse Cooperative is an artist-owned worker co-op based here in Baltimore, Maryland. We serve movements for collective liberation with art, design, and cultural strategy. We'll get into what some of that looks like today. What are some projects that we've done in the past? What are we aiming to do? And we also organize artist workers towards better living and working conditions through collective action. So the main way that we do that is obviously through the cooperative itself. But eventually we want to, share all the resources that we've gathered as worker owners of this cooperative and share them out to other artists. So those are our two main points in our mission. And you can go to the next slide. So right now the cooperative is made up of me and my comrade Ellie Yanagisawa. We also had another co-founder, Avia Krupnik, who is no longer organizing with us, but is still in community with us. And I just want to say a little bit about how Transverse got started. So me and Ellie met each other, I want to say like 7 years ago, doing artists activism in DC. We were both very active in different collectives, and we're looking to figure out the ways to be the most effective with our art and affecting change in the world that we wanted to see. We also wanted to be working with other artists. And we also wanted to move closer towards having our art be one of our main streams of income. This was really challenging, doing it in the way that most art collectives are organized. I really recommend the essay To Everyone, Tyranny of Structurelessness by Joe Freeman. If you haven't read it, check it out. It explains the problem of a lot of arts collectives, which is that there's usually not a structure that's, laid out and discussed ahead of time, because that's what people think of as freedom and as democracy. It's like not having a structure. It's just letting whatever emerge, whatever wants to emerge. But what can happen is that our dominant ways of interacting with each other, systems of oppression, end up entering into that structurelessness. And so that's what we found in our collective organizing with the kind of structureless collectives that we were part of. You can go to the next slide. So this is a bit of my artwork. And just to say a bit more about myself, so I'm a Chilean American, non-binary, queer, chronically ill, mixed media artist and solidarity economy organizer. I have been in the worker co-op scene for over 7 years now. I was a worker owner in college at a food cooperative that had been around for 44 years. So it had a huge legacy and, many generations of worker owners that I was learning from. And that really converted me into this whole understanding of how we can relate to each other through true workplace democracy and owning our labor and the products of our labor. And so I always wanted to start an arts cooperative. And, at some point after meeting other artist organizers with similar problems, similar visions, this is, how we started Transverse. And so you can see in my mixed media work, I do painting, illustration, I do sculpture. I made that frame there in the bottom middle. I do ceramics. And so a lot of these mixed media skills show up in our artwork as a collective. I also work for the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops as a trainer and consultant. And so we bring the knowledge of worker co-ops to other movement organizations. And so if you want that sort of training and consulting, hit me up. And we are having a conference in Chicago this September, so we can share a little bit more about that in the chat. You can go to the next slide. So this is some of Ellie's work. This is a really this is all really graphic design heavy, but Ellie is also an amazing jeweler. I'm wearing earrings that they made. They're a muralist. They do lots of different kinds of mixed media art as well. And you can tell here that they've done a lot of Palestinian liberation artwork recently and have been doing a lot of mutual aid and fundraising for Palestinian families recently. And Ellie also works in their day job as a web developer. So we touch on all of these skills in our co-op, which is why I'm bringing this up. Next slide. So here we have our values, and the thing that we always orient towards is collective liberation. Our values apply to how we interact with each other within the worker co-op, but also how we relate to our community and to our clients. So we're always thinking about how can we all get free. in terms of how we're working together and the projects that we choose to work on. We don't work on any projects that are out of alignment with our values. That doesn't have to be the case for worker co-ops. That's just how we chose to go about doing our work, because we realized there was this really big gap in services, actually, of artists coming together, owning their artwork, and forming like a design firm, basically. Next is arts labor organizing. So we're always thinking about how do we uplift our dignity as workers, as well as the dignity of other arts within our cooperative, and have been thinking a lot about throwing an offers and needs market, for example, at some point in this year, as to like all of our decisions right now are made by consensus between me and Ellie, but also with our clients when we're working on projects, decisions are made by consensus between ourselves and whoever's on their team that's working with us. And into the future, we want to bring this into our community work as well. So yeah, making sure that we're always listening to make sure information is transparent, easy to understand. Otherwise, it's really difficult to have a truly democratic workplace or relationship with community. And lastly is collaborative learning. So this is all, an experiment for us. We've been around for about 2 years or so. And so there's a lot we've had to learn, and we're doing it together because we don't believe in siloing skills. So obviously everyone has things that they're good at, and we lean on those when we can, but we also are trying to, skill up everyone within the collective and provide opportunities for learning together. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is basically our vision broken into 3 parts. So the first part is the worker co-op. That's what we're doing right now. That's basically, doing this commission and grant-based work for movement organizations, movement organizers or researchers, and producing like services and products. In the next 5 to 10 years, we want to build a housing co-op. So this may be like a loosely affiliated cooperative. It may be somehow the same organization. I have a feeling just legally it's going to have to be separate. But this will look like mixed residential and commercial space here in Baltimore, where basically we want to buy an apartment building and turn the bottom floor into event and gallery space, and the rest of it into residential units that would prioritize the worker owners of the co-op into getting housing. But also, we imagine it would have enough units to where it would be open to the wider artists or cooperatives recently. And then lastly, we view ourselves as ecosystem stewards, particularly of like the arts solidarity economy, artists to cooperative resources, connecting rad art organizations to one another, and organizing artists around the world, and translate it into meaningful organizing. So you can go to the next slide. So now we're going to touch on briefly past client projects that we've done for our work, because we're figuring it out as we go, what it looks like to work together in a worker co-op. Also just testing our assumptions about what's needed when you're starting a business. It's important to go in with a hypothesis of them. So these projects have been really helpful for that. Next slide. Okay, so this project we just wrapped up. This is a coloring book called Transit and Transition, and this came out of a group of researchers in the Riverdale, Maryland effects of a new metro line being constructed in their community, and they wanted a way to translate that data into something that was going to be meaningful for organizing and community engagement. And so We came up with the idea of doing a color. We also facilitated an event for them with an artist talk. There was coloring. It was great. There were lots of kids there. And so these aren't whenever they want to continue using it as an organizing tool. So next slide. Then we have the public power protests. This was one of the first commissions that we did. I think we did this about 2 years ago. And the design on the left was designed by Ellie. So that is a poster. It also was turned into a t-shirt, and it also was turned into these like little informational cards. And the image on the bottom right, I designed and was like a 10-foot long banner. And basically this protest was against Pepco, protesting like the skyrocketing utility costs, as well as the end of the utility moratorium, which was when you didn't have to pay for your utilities during the pandemic. So when that ended, obviously it put a lot of people in really difficult positions. So we were collaborating with them on the art for the action. Next. Okay, governance. So right now we have a governance matrix, which basically outlines like how we make decisions about different things, who needs to be consulted about the committee structure for when we're a bit bigger, and we're theocracy, and we're going to make them like a branding style guide. So into our cooperative organizing and development without having to pay a bunch of money for services when we don't have that startup capital. We attend a lot of webinars, trainings, activities about worker co-ops and their governance, finance, ownership structure, and conflict resolution. I can say confessional membership organization for worker co-ops. It's really complicated. And there are so many resources out there to help you. And many of them are free. But it does take a lot of investment, and historically a lot of worker co-ops have come out of study groups. So that's how we, think about this being sustainable, is that we're learning like that. And community with us, we like to kind of informally interview folks and just learn about what are the challenges people are going. And yeah, so if that sounds like something you'd like to do with us, next slide. Okay, so we've been working on a website for a while. Thankfully, Ellie is a web developer of all of our past work. We've done more projects than the ones that I just mentioned. It'll also be a way to like documents and processes as we develop them. So that way other groups can, the website will be a blog and shop, but we're not there yet. And just to say about that, like we have pretty high standards, for the work that we do. We're always being very thoughtful about what we put out there, but also we try not to let our standards get in the way of just doing the thing and knowing that it's an experiment, we're learning, we're gonna mess up, and so, or it's gonna be incomplete that works. Building off of that is the business plan. So this is in pretty early step with, and how much do we charge different sorts of groups, financial projections. So like, what would it take for us to be fully sustainable, be able to employ like X number of worker owners, our marketing plan, lots of feedback on it. But we're playing on what our skills are already. Lots of ideas and resources about recruiting new worker owners, but we don't have a ton written because we want to make sure that there's a structure, there's enough of a structure there that folks will feel, like nurtured in coming. We need to formalize our founders' compensation policy. So right now our commission-based work. So for example, the coloring book, we were paid for that. Some of that money goes, a lot of our work, most of our work right now is not paid. And that's really common for businesses as they're starting. That's pretty much what has to happen for a business to start. And so there are ways to compensate founders. What we're seeking in new worker owners, we have a lot of that written down already. But for example, like what are the skills that Ellie and I are lacking that we need support in? Transparently, that's probably to do that work. And we also want to have our business plan done so people can see that, at least a nice first draft of it, in order to engage with us. So we're also actively working on commissions. Right now, we don't seek them out in our lab, or someone contacts us, then we'll put together a proposal co-op. And so we are just open when we're like, oh, we haven't done this thing yet, but we'll explain if we're confident. This is exactly where we're at. So let us know how we're doing. And it's been going well so far. Next, we need to actually incorporate. So far, we've been operating as independent contractors. We handle our own taxes. It's just been easier that way for now. We need to hire a lawyer and figure out what legal formation is the best for our specific industry. Part of the reason we've been putting that off is that it does building up the money in Transverse's bank account, so that way it doesn't have to come out of my or Ellie's personal funds. So that feels good. Transverse, both Ellie and I and any future worker owners we bring in, our solo and community work is interesting because we're all very active in our communities. Been learning throughout this journey with Transverse. The first thing is like 1, 2, 3, 4 steps that I can give you to build a business. And the thing is that we really liked that. Once we accepted that, we felt really free because we realized, oh, well, we really want to feel like preserved and taken care of during this process. And so if we just accept that it's going to be, we're always balancing like the small details with the bigger picture. And I think we do a good job of that because we're always be learning and growing, lean into your skills. So again, balancing like we're doing something we haven't done before, which is founding a worker-owned arts cooperative. And we also, big worker co-op background. And so, because it's more efficient, but Ellie has also been learning and growing. It's vice versa for like tech things. I'm not that great there. And lastly is radical care, relationality, self-awareness, and honesty. And we're not trying to continue, we can, and just step into the relationality that's there. And yeah, that takes a lot of self-awareness to know when you are being urgent or when you're, putting the business ahead of your own health or ahead of the health of your company. Yeah, the work that we're putting into the co-op. Okay, last slide. Hit us up. Yeah, please feel free to reach out. We're very friendly, and that's our Google Voice number. If you call it or text it, it'll go to both me and Ellie. That's our email, then it's my email, Ellie's email, and those are our Instagrams below the emails. So follow along with us, our journey. We've been growing, sharing more. And feel free to reach out to us to collaborate with us if you want to commission us, or if you just want to learn more about what we've been doing. We're more than happy to share. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Nati for the Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you, Camila. Thank you, Transverse. Thank you, audience. I think it's so important to hear from these groups on the ground, as Francisco presented. It is David and Goliath out there, but there are folks on the ground that are creating these cultures of care, that are rethinking the ways in the next 20 minutes. So I'm going to just kind of shared leadership, best function in the future. And we're going to give that to Francisco first.
economy as more micro, as more sort of small scale, and of economic democracy as solidarity economy on the macro of grassroots control. We have a module that gets into some of this, where we talk about the difference between cooperatives, land trusts, and community finance vehicles, how they relate to each other, how you achieve that kind of coordination at the scale of millions now. And obviously it would be different because they're not typically investor-owned business. Or do we really want full democracy all the way up to the national, an excellent question.
Camila, did you have any response to that about scale and shared leadership, how that shows up in Transverse?
Yeah, I mean, Mondragon Cooperative in the Basque region of Spain is always being talked about as this example of a huge cooperative corporation that they have like hospitals, and they also have like a wider way of taking in decisions from the whole circles that focus on, and a lot of worker co-ops operate in a similar way without like that exact wording. But I think that's pretty scalable, to just keep in mind that in order to together, it's also important in your own cooperative organizing just to keep in mind, like, how can we work with other co-ops, not just on the level of within your own city, but even internationally. There are worker-owned printing cooperatives. So whenever we're making anything, however, we can use like union-made, worker co-op made products, we always do that. And so we're excited to see how that will scale as our co-op grows.
That is the mission of what we're trying to do at Art.coop. We're trying to inspire artists and culture workers to unlearn neoliberal capitalism so that we can actually live into something different. And we know that when our artists are creating from that place, you all have so much more influence on the mass culture. And so that for us is why it's so critical that we're trying to really engage artists and culture workers around these alternatives. So that rather than pushing, our number one pop artist, the big thing about her is that she's got the most expensive house that's ever been made. That is what we value right now in our culture. How can we shift from that kind of domination and extraction and winners take all economy, in my opinion, where I want our cultures to go? So I just hope y'all didn't mind me answering a question there. I'm going to go to a next question here. How do we prioritize addressing the individual and collective trauma that colors interpersonal dynamics and often causes rupture in these alternative efforts despite intellectual agreement? Great question. I think we probably all have examples of working at this. Francisco or Camila, who wants to take this one?
Not selling coffee. We are trying to shift mass consciousness. So this is the work. It is not easy. All of us have seen organizations suffer or even collapse due to interpersonal conflict. In my way, in my opinion, there's no way around. I think that the organizations that do this successfully, people learn how to deal with disruption, how to deal with people's interpersonal traumas, how to deal with the harm that people have done each other, and it's simply, inevitable. Often, people come to movements for justice and equality highly traumatized, right? That is what led them to question these systems of capitalism and patriarchs, individually and collectively working through those traumas, right? And there's just no other way around it. I wish I could wave a magic wand. I wish there were easy solutions, things, like you can just pull up a list of tips and tricks, but all I can say is organizations that are successful do learn how to deal with this stuff, and it is inevitable.
Yeah, I can build on that. That was great. and I agree with all of that. Within Transverse, it's definitely one of the things we're most concerned about, because yeah, we've seen it rip apart a lot of artist collectives, and worker co-ops as well. And so I think that's one reason that we're also waiting to bring in new worker owners, because we want to have a structure for dealing with conflict resolution, and interpersonal issues, because a lot of organizations just don't have that. They ignore it until an issue comes up, and that can cause a lot of irreparable harm. So we're trying to think about how do we can't prevent conflict, but how do we create structures that are going to help people land in a way that's productive and is generative at the end of the day to the relationships. So we're learning about this ourselves. I think right now it feels more straightforward because even with our previous co-founder, you know, there were years of relationship before being co-worker owners together. And so we know a lot about, you know, how the other people act and have a lot of good faith. And so part of this is also just recognizing that with new worker owners that we want to bring in, we're not just thinking of them as like other people in our business, but other people holistically who have needs that outside of the worker co-op we want to try to meet. So like, you know, helping people with meals if needed, you know, doing potlucks, getting to know people as friends. That's going to look different with every person who's in the cooperative, but just trying to build intimacy and humanity outside of the work.
Just shared picnics, getting together. I think we lost a lot of that during COVID, and it's so critical that we come back together in safe ways. Next question here. How can we ensure governance models that are supposed to be quote unquote democratic don't end up being utilized in ways that erase power dynamics?
As a worker and your employer, right? One of them you can't be a capitalist without workers, and you can't be a worker without capitalists, right? So it's about that kind of relationship. And how do you change that, right? When we come out of that, you know, going, and a lot of people are tempted to just go fully horizontal, have it, as Camila mentioned, you know, no structure just means that those with the biggest voice, with the most resources, power, training, education, often people in more privileged positions, white cishet men, will often dominate the procedure. So those who bring, you know, so just saying there's no leader doesn't mean that informally leaders and sort of, you know, these hierarchies do often reemerge. And we need to learn to flex our democracy muscles. What I have seen again with co-ops, they say they're going to do, and are often behave in very selfish ways. And what we learn is that once to do it well, learn to figure it out, right? So one of my favorite examples, 2 minutes rule, and we will cut off your mic, right? So this idea that like someone's going to get up there and like dominate the proceedings or disrupt them or lead people off on a tangent. It's like, no, we have a certain amount of time, and they learned like we have 2 hours to get through this meeting, and therefore everyone has 2 minutes, and we're going to be ruthless and cut you off. And people generally adhered to the 2 minutes, you know, but it took them. So I'm sure Camila has some more personal.
Yeah, again, 100%, all of that. I think it's also really important to always be educating yourself on anti-oppressive frameworks and history of resistance and communities outside of the ones that you belong to. And so just keeping in mind diversity of thought and tactics, because in our worker co-op space, ideally, there are going to be, a myriad of voices in the room. And so it makes sense that there are going to be, misunderstandings that people have and whatnot, but it is a muscle. Like, we have to learn to be anti-oppressive, not just democratic. Because I do see that in a lot of worker co-ops that they think like, oh, well, we're a worker co-op. That means, therefore, like, we are anti-oppressive inherently. And I think certainly they are more anti-oppressive. That structure is more anti-oppressive than the traditional business model. But yeah, there can be lots of social dynamics or unspoken things. Like, if you have a better paying job, or you're able to work less hours, or you don't have kids, you're going to have more free time to contribute to the worker co-op as it's starting up. And, time and capacity for this work, while it's, pro bono, is needed. And at the same time, that's a privilege to be able to do that. So I think it's important that especially the founders are thinking about how they can increase equity within the co-op at the starting level, be that, just doing lots of check-ins around how the space can be made more accessible to people with different needs, sharing more information.
Amazing. Thank you, Camila. I think we'll have time for two more. Camila, for you, can you share a story a little bit, fleshing out some examples? Someone had a question. They said, I want to hear more about the emotions artists experience when you create in this way, and how you observe your own work doing it in
question. I think we feel really proud, with the coloring book. At the end of it, we just felt so much pride over what we had produced, because at every single level possible, it was a collaborative effort, either between me and Ellie. Like, we were constantly swapping sketches. We were listening to a lot of interviews from the commission. We had constant feedback. And so we were just really proud of how that all translated, and felt like this fulfillment, because it was living into our values, really close with. Or even doing art on my own, you don't get that sense of like just releasing this thing on a life of its own after we do it. And there's a lot of sense of like release, and I think curiosity too. Like, we get really excited because we know that we can always follow up with our client and say, what's happened with this? Like, where has it gone to? What conversations have emerged? And yeah, that's what we feel about it.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Camila. I think we'll do one more question. I want to shout out Cecia Dominguez, an amazing cultural organizer in Salt Lake City, where I live, and some art assemblies that she was a part of in 2022 in Los Angeles with Naval LA. And they were bringing together artists around these questions around systems change. And this question really touched, as artists and culture workers, how might we enable cultural production and meaning making led by folks directly impacted by colonial cultures and whiteness? Heavy one, but I think it's something that is always on our mind as we're doing this work, that it doesn't stray so far from the original purpose. Do you want to take that first, Francisco?
These concepts can be quite abstract and heady, but this is part of the problem with capitalism is, we produce culture for profit, right? So that means, one, those consumers who have money get the culture they want, and then those consumers who do not have money do not get all the culture they deserve, all the cultural production, right? And often, that is racialized, it is gendered, it is certainly nationalized, right? So, often artists of color in the US or artists from the global South have to appeal to white American or white European audiences, right? That's the name of the game. You are trying to make a living by selling your art. You have to sell your art to the people who have money, right? So as long as we are operating under a capitalist logic, under a market logic, under a for-profit logic, are culture to people in your community, right? So I used to live in Sierra Leone, for example, and it is almost impossible to be a Sierra Leonean artist who relies on Sierra Leonean customers or clients, or a Sierra Leonean audience, right? So in order works, again, away from private ownership towards collective, which is often, again, rooted in our ancestral traditions, so that we can produce culture for us, by us, right? Where often it is for us, it is by us for someone else.
Yeah, I want to add on to another challenge. It's a lot about connection, like feeding into the machine of like what institutions say is value funding is done overall. That's going to continually be a problem. I think that this shift, decolonial art education, there's this kind of work as well. But I think this is again where I'm just going to say cooperatives are great because you're able to collectivize some of the risk of doing this work. I think when you are doing it on your own as a freelance, putting down, for example, I know an artist who had to put down like 30K, and she was able to do that because of the positionality that she had. But yeah, there's a lot of privilege with that. And so by collectivizing our labor, we're going to even possible to do, because the thing is if we as even ask for it. So I think it's being pushed.
We're fortunate to be in comradeship with people asking those questions. There's an incredible amount of resource mobilization within the solidarity economy. And so I think that would be a great resource for folks to think about how we organize within, without, and against philanthropy, and how we need all of that. So thank you for bringing that up, Camila. Do either of you have any final words or things you want to share with our audience, the audience that'll be watching this later, about why the solidarity economy needs artists and artists need a solidarity economy before we wrap up?
And then the solidarity economy movement, if we are ever going to value the leadership of artists and creative workers who have the ability to shift the imagination, to refract reality, to encourage us to think and live and relate to each other in different ways.
Artists are uplifted for our ability to build bridges and make information more accessible and academic, and I love that stuff, but also it's really hard to engage with sometimes. And so artists' skill set is in making information more attractive, more accessible, interpreting it in different ways. And I think it's really normal for people to need multiple different ways of something being communicated for it to click. And so I think researchers, movement organizers can really tap on artists for that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to you both, Francisco and Camila. This is what Through the Portal, Growing the World We Want is about. It's about bringing together insurgent, radical scholars and bringing them in conversation with artists and grassroots organizers. So you got a little bit of taste of that today. This is the kickoff of our 3-part series, Call to Artists Through the Portal Learning Series. So we just wrapped up the economics portal. Next Wednesday, we're going to be diving into the climate portal with Mark Chavez from the Climate Justice Alliance. If you're an artist or culture worker who feels the impending doom of climate catastrophe, well, guess what? There's hundreds of frontline organizations around this country working on this, and they need you. So please tune in next Wednesday, the 14th. Mark, it will be Haymarket YouTube channel for those who missed it. And then the last part of the series will be with Richie Reseda. from Question Culture, who will be delving into the portal of abolition. Richie is a cultural worker. I want to miss that as well. Spread the word about this series. Check out the conference that's coming end of September through the portal, Growing the World We Want. There's an incredible flyer by Silo Tropical, I believe their name is. Incredible artists from Latin America. You'll see that flyer that's on the flyer for this. And you can start getting your travel stuff going to get to Chicago at the end of the month for that, as well as the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops Conference, which is the week before. So shout out to a lot of things going on in Chicago these next few weeks and months. So that we want. We're going to need all of us to do that together. So again, thank you, Haymarket, SJI, University of Illinois, Chicago, Artists for Radical Imagination.